Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. We're very excited, actually, to be able to host this here at NC State. And Carrie is the one who actually made it all happen. It wasn't me. She just would send me reminder emails, like, you haven't done this yet. And I'm like, doing it, sorry. For some of you, this may be for the anthropologists in the house. So some of our Anther lectures will be maybe a little bit basic, but hopefully the hands-on part with actually using 3D ID will be very useful. But some of you who don't have an anthropology background, hopefully this will give you enough of a background to be able to use 3D ID. I guess the first thing we should talk about is the concept of race, and I'm going to talk about it from a forensic anthropological perspective. And that really means it's like there's been a lot of debate in anthropology about race and the concept of race, and should we be assessing race or ancestry, as we call it now. I just put up this. This was something that was said by Gill in 1998 about ancestry or racial affinity. All right. So the importance of for our biological profile, again, is the determination of ancestry, or as we used to call it, racial affinity. And if you look at it from a pragmatic perspective and from an identification perspective, if we don't know the ancestral origin of an individual, it makes it very difficult to get a full biological profile and also narrow down your unidentified, and to be able to get ultimately an identification. All right, so ancestry or racial affinity has been historically politically charged. There's a lot of confusion still whether it's you're dealing with cultural or biological identity, and sometimes those get mixed in with even in our census, as I will talk about a little bit later, all those like cultural constructs get mixed in with the biological constructs, and then we're not really sure what we're dealing with at that point, and it's important to be able to tease those things out. Another question has been is, does race exist? There's a lot of people saying that no, it does not exist. Also, it's a conceptual problem, whether you're dealing with race or ancestry. Some people say, since as we have moved to looking at from the human variation perspective, and we're using the term ancestral origin instead of race, people are just saying that the only thing that we're doing is replacing one term for another, but it actually means the same thing, which it really doesn't, and we're going to talk about this in a little bit. So it's a conceptual problem, and also fear of the legal system imposing or forcing certain categories, and those you will see also over the years in the census. They keep adding categories, they take categories out, then they put them back in, then they change the name of them, they take origin out, they add descent, and they're all confused as well. And we also see it in the medical examiner system. A lot of times you get some of the older cases, people of the term of what you would call Hispanic are called white, sometimes they're not called white. Is Hispanic really a true biological construct? And Kate has done a lot of research on this, and we'll talk about this in a little bit too. So some of those things get confusing. So sometimes you'll see white, non-white. You know, we used to use this horrible term called mongoloid at one point, which makes me cringe. But we'll talk about all those things as well. So also some of the things that we have to be careful in a global setting. Race has been used as an excuse for genocide. For example, in Rwanda, the Hutus against the Tutsis, even though they all originated from the same language group or population, right? So they found enough differences to have an excuse to commit genocide. They used terms as you had to annihilate the cockroaches and things like that. So it's an oppression kind of thing that they have used race. In the Balkans as well, you had people that originated from the same Slavic stock or origins were fighting against each other, and you had three different groups. One was Catholic Croatians, Orthodox Christians, that were Serbians. You had Bosnian Muslims, which were religious differences, but they used that also as an excuse to exterminate individuals. So are we really dealing about race, or are we dealing with, you know, the term that the genocidaires themselves used as ethnic cleansing? So those are all things that go into play. And I know for a while people don't want you to look at the differences across the globe and human biological differences because they feel that, there'll always be someone out there that will use that, to their advantage and also to the detriment of another population. So ancestry, what does ancestry mean? Basically, it's a lineage or those who compose a line of natural descent. So someone who descends from a particular line. Race, it's determined geographically and culturally. So you have geography and culturally derived in there, who share a common gene pool and are similar in many characteristics. And one of the things that people have objected to the use of the term race is because it actually means subspecies and other biological sciences. And we're not dealing with subspecies. We're dealing with the same species, right, not subspecies, of just variations of humans. So that's where that comes from, too. Ethnic groups are a group of persons who share the same language and customs. So that has also been used. I know if you've seen talks that they deal with, someone's ethnicity versus someone's ancestry. Well, as a forensic anthropologist, we can't really determine ethnicity, right? Because that's more of a cultural, social construct. We are looking at the underlying biology of that individual, right? And that's what we're trying to get at. So again, ancestry, back in the day, it was related to distance. As we all know, humans will mate with whoever's closest to them generally, right? That's what human nature is. So generally, you are closest to the individuals, or you are more related to or morphologically similar to the people that you are in the vicinity with. And also, you can look at demis or populations or breeding populations. That's generally my area of research. So you can pretty much group groups of people into whatever form. So you can look at religious affiliation, that can be a group, and you can look at the differences and similarities between those groups. You can look at language as similarities and differences and call that your population. So we're essentially looking at breeding populations. And generally, when we talk about breeding populations, individuals are more similar in morphology with those others within their breeding population than others that are not, right? Because they're exchanging genes. So that's that. The main problem with the race concept is does not reflect the fluidity of interbreeding. So what we look at are the mean or average differences among groups, but you always have along those lines, right? You have people that along the border lines that you will see that share traits with other groups. It also does not address gene flow. And also humans do not belong to a single group for a long period of time. So as time evolves and as we go, we have airplanes, right? So before, mountains used to be good genetic barriers, right? So you would generally mate with people that are closer. You're not going to climb the Andes, right, to go find a mate when you can, find one up the road like a mile, right? So now we have cars, we have airplanes that makes this interbreeding a lot more easier to do. So we will, in our populations, modern contemporary populations, have a lot of admixture. So those are the things that we can actually pick out. So if you have a forensic case, rarely now are we not admix or have some type of mix of other populations. So what I generally do is say European with African admixture. So I think to stay on the safe side of things. We have few very moderately distinct breeding populations. If you take the world at large, you can have Europe. You can group them as a European component. European Americans would be very distinct. The US is an amalgamation of various European groups. We're not based on nationalistic boundaries, whereas in Europe you still have national boundaries that help somewhat curtail interbreeding. For example, you have Africa and certain groups also. For example, in India, you have the caste system that would also serve as a breeding or a genetic barrier as well. the American Anthropological Association's position on race, they have this huge website called Project Race, I think. It's online. And for forensic anthropologists, this is, I guess, kind of a burr in our side many times, because they are vehement about that races do not exist, that we're all the same. If we look at DNA, we all have the same DNA makeup. But what they're missing is that that's correct. We also 98%, the same as a chimpanzee as well, but you're not going to tell me that we are not distinct, right? That we do not have geographic adaptation. So basically our overall schema when we're looking at ancestral groups, we're looking at origins or geographic origins of populations. So this is what we're looking at, and not necessarily just the genetic makeup of individuals. We're looking at the phenotype and what we have adapted to geographically over time. Okay, so again, why do we need to assess ancestry? Well, it allows us to, we can estimate a person's ancestry to a pretty good degree of specificity. We're pretty good at that because we do have geographic adaptations that we can actually visually see in the craniofacial region and in some other parts of the body, and we can also quantify those differences. So what we essentially are doing is determining the immediate ancestor of that one individual to try to group them into a specific. So we would like to say, for example, you have an unknown, you can say this person is of Asian ancestry or European ancestry or African ancestry, which will also help the identification process. Ancestry implies broad geographically defined areas, like we were discussing Europe, Africa, Asia, but again, those can be subdivided into other specific groups. And one thing that we have done with 3D ID, and actually Bruce Anderson planted that seed several years ago, is to not just use that term Hispanic that I'll talk about in a minute, but to subdivide that into more of geographic region like Circum-Caribbean, Mesoamerica, South America, because they're all very distinct. And someone from, for example, Puerto Rico or Cuba will have some African ancestry in there. We'll have European ancestry in there, but someone, for example, from Honduras will have more indigenous ancestry. So they're very distinct, and they can be teased out. And we can make those kinds of assessments. So we no longer use the term race. It's the dirty word, right? Even though we are accused of still doing the same thing, we're not. We're looking at human biological variation. We try to avoid the older typological or taxonomic things. Before, they had three major races. They had Mongoloid, Negroid, and Caucasoid were the three types of main three areas that individuals were grouped into. However, we know those are incorrect, and those were done to try to set up a schema of who was more intelligent than another. So it had, for example, negative connotations associated with it, and we have moved away from those things because we know those things are not true. Okay, so ancestry determination in the United States. This is from the 1990 U.S. Census, and this shows you the distribution of American Indian, Eskimo, and Aleut persons. And it seems like they go around picking individuals on the U.S. Census, and then they just add, I'm actually not sure who actually decides on the categories that they use. So this shows you the distribution. The ones with the dark green have the most distribution of these individuals in the United States. So you can kind of see that. And it also helps when you're doing a forensic case to know your demographics, the demographics of your area. If you have a heavy Hispanic, of Mesoamerican origin, those are things that you should probably incorporate into your thought process. Okay, so know your demographics. Of course, there's always an exception to the rule, but you should always look at your demographics. Asian and Pacific Islander persons. So obviously we don't have too many across the U.S., but as you get to the West Coast, you start seeing the darker numbers over there. Black persons, there's a big cluster on the eastern United States. And Hispanic origin, also from 1990. You have, of course, along the border and in Florida, especially in Hialeah, where you had a lot of Cuban immigrants coming in. So that was from 1990. And why does Hispanic, Hispanic is what, more of a cultural construct, right? It has absolutely no social, or no, excuse me, biological meaning whatsoever. It means people of Spanish-speaking countries. But you can have people of Spanish-speaking countries that are very biologically different or have different ethno-historical origins. Again, like Mexico, more of an indigenous. Cuba, you can have some African, some European. Someone from South America would have indigenous, but a different type of indigenous or Native American ancestry than, let's say, in Central America. So all those things are very distinct, but they would have all been grouped into this umbrella of Hispanic, which is meaningless. Let's see some of the changes in the U.S. Census from 1970 to 2000. In 1970, it's the first time the data were collected on Hispanic populations. So in there they have Mexican, Puerto Rican, Cuban, Central or South America, other Spanish, no or some of these. All right, so you're supposed to fill some of these out. In 1980, they added the question, is the person of Spanish or Hispanic? But to me, Hispanic means Spanish. And if you actually talk to someone from Europe, from Spain, and you call them Hispanic, they get really angry. They're European. They don't consider themselves as part of, I guess, the Americas, right, which is a whole different construct. I guess no was moved from the list, and then Central and South America were removed in 1980. Then in 1990, they dropped the word descent and added origin in there. So obviously they're confused and like kind of thinking about what they're supposed to be saying. And then in 2000, they added Latino and dropped the word origin. So they dropped descent, switched it out for origin, then they dropped that, then they added Latino. And I know Latino means a specific cultural entity. If you call, for example, someone from Panama Latino, they'll look at you like, what the heck are you talking about? What is that? You know, so it has a completely, and there's a new term too, Ladino. So, you know, how are you supposed to use these terms which are biologically meaningless, and you're having people trying to do a census and categorize themselves? To be obnoxious, I always say I'm admixed. So to try to throw one person throwing off the census, right? So even when I get asked at the doctor's office, they always say race, I put admix. So unfortunately, you won't be able to use my data for anything, right? This is something that Steve Owlsley did, and it's a poster, and I can't remember, it was for a couple years back, and he was looking at the Asian question, or Mongoloid question. And also, I guess, just as I was as frustrated, and Kate was as well, with the term Hispanic, he was just as frustrated with everybody grouping or lumping everybody together under Mongoloid or Asian, which they're very distinct. And usually when you do, when you had those three main categories, remember, Caucasoid, Negroid, and Mongoloid, that also included individuals of Native American origin, which could be historic or prehistoric, which you shouldn't group together anyway. Granted that Asian ancestry, the Americas, we all originated, from the Bering Strait, and we can tie back to Native American origins, but we're very distinct groups of, or populations that we have. And here he clearly shows that you have a nice overlap of African and European, right? And on here, there's a distinct margin between Asia and then between Native American populations. So there, and within Asia also you have a lot of different other groups that you can also tease apart as well. All right, this is something I did in 2005, I want to say, or 2004. We were looking at groups using geometric morphometrics, looking at the different populations. And We compared different groups from the Americas with African Americans, with European Americans, or from the Terry collection and the donated collection, from Panama, Mexico, and then we had Afro-Antillean Panamanian, more of a African mixture. Panama has a unique history where you have a lot of indigenous populations in certain parts of Panama. You also have some populations with a lot of, especially on the Caribbean side or Atlantic side, with a lot of African origin. Because of the slave trade, they brought in a lot of Africans during the slave trade. And they also have a lot of Chinese individuals that were brought in to help build the canal. So then you have a big mix of all these groups. So here we see that African and Cuba are closely related based on those trees, right? And then Spain and European American, but they also cluster with Cuban and African. And that clustering shows you that there's some common descent going on there, especially with the two clusters together. And then you have Ecuador, Mexico, and Panama, and that's also showing some indigenous ancestry. And prehistorically, they have found that Mexico and Ecuador are very similar based on because these populations would travel along the coast. So, you know, they were not only sharing pottery in the past, but obviously they were sharing something else as well, right? And Cuba, pre-contact Cuba, that's been something very interesting. They are unlike any other in the Caribbean area, so they have a distinct origin that did not come from the westward migration from Venezuela, like we once thought. All right, this is someone of Hispanic origin. And we can see you will have an amalgamation of different traits. So for example, if you're in South Florida and someone is of Cuban ancestry, you will probably have an admixture of African, European, and a suite of traits that you can see. In someone in North Carolina, we get a lot of people from Mesoamerica. That's right, Clyde, isn't it? So we'll have a lot of indigenous ancestry in there, and I'm in the Southwest and then in the western part of the United States, also as they're coming up from Mexico. One of the things that we have found that works, and this came out in a 2008 paper in JFS, and I believe it was it Bruce's paper, Kate, do you remember?
The cultural profile?
Yeah. Yeah, Birkby and them, yes. And the protostylid, and actually we've been collecting this since we've been here. Every individual of Mesoamerican origin has a protostylid or a buccal pit on the molar. So that has been a very useful trait to use. And don't mind the trauma that the poor individual sustained, right? Another thing that we find is individuals of Hispanic ancestry or in the Americas have some complex sutures. And a lot of times that it's geographically specific, but many times we'll see individuals of Mesoamerican origin that have these complex sutures because they're asymmetrical in the vault. And that's most likely due to the plagiocephaly, or how you place your baby when they're young or when they're sleeping, and also the way they're carried. So that will cause that asymmetry in the vault. All right, so some of the things that we see here, you have Asian ancestry, you have an intermediate profile, meaning the part of the maxilla is moderate or intermediate compared to someone of African profile, which will have a projecting maxilla, or they will be prognathic. And someone of white Hispanic, generally a straight profile or lack of prognathism. And that would hold true with individuals without African origin, right? Not so much if you have a Hispanic population that does have African admixture. So those are things to keep in mind. Some of the other things that we can look at are dental morphology. The one on your upper left, shovel-shaped incisors, generally associated with Asian Native American, Hispanic if you have indigenous ancestry. European and African generally have a spatulate type incisor. We see a crenulated molar pattern in African populations and a smooth cusp pattern or Y4 pattern in European populations. Any questions so far? We're good? Yes?
I mean, complex sutures then are actually a reflection of a cultural feature, like wear on the teeth.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, some of it would be that. Some of it may be biologically induced, but some of it, yes, absolutely is cultural, especially when you see asymmetry in the vault.
Is it from more complex head wrapping of children, or is this just a simple matter of how they're laid? Or?
I think it's a simple matter of how they laid, because you see sometimes broad, you'll see some flattening on one side. It's not, in the past where you've had cranial binding, you will see very complex sutures. But I don't think there are any populations today that do that. So it's actually sometimes, for example, when you have migrant workers, they wrap the babies so tight against them. So that may produce some of the changes in the vault. Yeah. Yes?
In North Carolina is where you're primarily collecting the data, correct? Mm-hmm. What's the primary origin of the Hispanic population in North Carolina?
We have a lot of people from Central America coming through here. Honduras, El Salvador, that's right, Clyde, isn't it? Yeah, and it's like when I looked at the demographics, it was a Central American origin.
And do you think that the Back to Sleep program, educating everybody who watches the commercials to put their babies on their back may have to sleep? Changed any of this?
That's actually a really good question, because I know that the frequencies and the stats for positional plagiacephaly has increased tremendously since the Back to Sleep program in all kids. And a lot of kids now have to wear little helmets to kind of reshape their head. So if you see little kids with helmets, it's because they had positional plagiacephaly. But one thing that I noticed is like with the Hispanic population or the migrant workers, I think it's not necessarily the back to sleep problem, because a lot of the other skeletal features that we see, like spina bifida and some of the other things, it doesn't seem like they're getting a lot of prenatal care. So I'm not sure if that notice has quite gotten to them yet. But that would be an interesting thing to see.
And is the Hispanic population here primarily migrant workers, or do you have, LA is a little bit of a special case because we have such a high population of Hispanic individuals from all over.
All over. Mm-hmm.
And they're in every segment of society fairly equally at this point.
Right. Yeah, we have a lot of laborers that are of Hispanic origin. We have them also in most sectors now, but the individuals that come through the ME's office would be from a different, pool of individuals that you would find. So probably the pool that we're seeing, I would say more migrant workers, because most of them remain unidentified. So I would think it depends on the sector of society that you're getting your.
And one more question: do you think that they're primarily first generation migrants that you're looking at primarily, or second, third, fourth?
That's a good question. I hadn't actually really thought about it on those terms. Some of the cold cases probably first generation, but some of the later cases I wouldn't know. I don't know. Yeah. Because we even have, Clyde even has one in his office from a little boy from 10-year-old, right, from 98. So, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, good questions. Thank you. Some of the other traits that we look at to differentiate, just generalized, is European, Asian, rounded vault, no depression, post-bregma. Bregma is a landmark up here. Which from the coronal and sagittal suture, it intersects. And you have a post-pragmatic depression generally in African populations. So I actually I pulled this off the internet, and I really like that to show like the variation of Hispanic populations across the United States. What we found in that research with the phenogram on there was that Panamanians were very similar to Mexicans, based again on the migration patterns that you can find, and Ecuadorians. And also West Indian Panamanians had a little bit of similarity as well. This was very distinct from European, African, and modern Cuban affinities. So that shows a different descent as well, or origin. So I guess the census needs to add those terms back in because we keep using those over and over again, right? And basically, Hispanics are so diverse that we shouldn't group them under this one socially constructed umbrella. How do we determine ancestry? Well, we do it non-metric or through visual morphological traits like the protostylid, post-pragmatic depression. Those are things that you can't necessarily quantify. We use metric methods, which you use continuous and measurable points. Traditionally, we've used calipers. They've worked quite well so far. And then we apply those lists of measurements to multivariate statistics to allocate crania to a distinct group. We can look at population level differences is almost exclusively derived from adults, so anybody over the age of 18, 19 is usually what we use in our samples. And that's due to the confounding effects of growth, allometry, and changes during that growth period. But there has been some new research, well, relatively new research, that has shown that some of these morphological characteristics are actually found in utero. So we can look at some of these things as well. And we'll show you how, using geometric morphometrics, you can actually look at younger individuals, not necessarily only adults, to look at groups of different ancestral origin. And those are any questions? We're good.